Good morning. Thanks for joining us here on The Open. Hope you're having a wonderful start to your week. And it's going to be a big week for Apple. The tech giant is expected to unveil its latest lineup of products at a big event on Wednesday. But ahead of that, the company is already in the headlines for a tariff battle with U.S. President Donald Trump. For perspective on that, we're joined now by Juliette Powell, the author and founder of Turing AI. She joins us from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. Juliette, it seems like every big company has to be ready for getting called out by the president on Twitter these days. What's your take on how companies like Apple get caught up in the middle of this tariff war?
Well, the reality is that, Trump has an agenda, and that agenda is not dependent on whether you're a tech giant or an automaker, because we saw Apple get called out by Trump. We also saw Ford get called out by Trump when it comes to bringing manufacturing back to America to make America great again. The reality is that, it costs a lot of money to be able to move all of your manufacturing back to America. And the reality is also that there are just certain things that we are no longer trained to produce in America at a low enough cost, so that even if you do add up those tariffs from the fact that you're now building all of this stuff in other countries, it's still lower to the consumer than bringing all of those jobs and all of that work and manufacturing back to the United States. This is something that, is debatable on all sides here in the United States. Perhaps in Canada, you can be a little bit more objective, but it's fascinating to watch how this plays out, especially that it's playing out on Twitter. Did you ever think that you'd see the day that happened, John?
I don't think we did expect that, but on some levels, it's actually an encouraging thing, because there are a lot of companies that like to take credit for any moves they make to create jobs at home, whether at home is Canada or the United States. And Apple is one of those companies. I mean, before we were talking about feeling pressure from President Trump on Twitter, they were a company that were playing up the idea of bringing back some jobs to the United States, and yet there's a lot of messaging coming out of a company like Apple as well. How many jobs are we really talking about? How many more jobs could be created if they chose to change their supply chain? So it's almost like there's a healthy conversation, even though it can leave these companies scrambling on some days with these tweets.
Yeah, and at the same time, it also leaves employees struggling. And, I'm doing a lot of research on college campuses in the United States and in Europe. And again, a lot of people would love to go work for Apple. They would absolutely love to. But in terms of being able to position themselves to be an entity that will be useful and picked up by Apple is just as difficult as trying to figure out, whether it's time or not to invest in Apple. And so there are much larger conversations. You're right. I do love the fact that they're much more public than they used to be, and perhaps less hypocrisy, since one side of the company can call out, in fact, the other, because it's much more public and transparent. And at the same time, I think one of the reasons why, beyond the design and, its ease of use, one of the reasons why so many people love Apple products is the fact that they feel, especially in this environment, that they are more secure. And as you know, John, Apple was just called out because one of the apps that it was selling in its app store was in fact sending all of our private information to a server in China. So there too, we're seeing these companies being called out. But the reality is it is still our responsibility as individuals to see where we want to consume, where we want to invest, and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
No doubt. And while we spent a lot of time figuring out where these trade battles are going to go, when these companies, and you reference not just Apple, but Ford, and certainly there are other examples of the president maybe giving them a little nudge of encouragement to create some jobs in the United States on Twitter. Right. His trade hawk, Peter Navarro, who a lot of people in Canada are very nervous about his policies on trade. He was on Fox News on the weekend, and he was talking about, at the end of the day, have a lot of companies chosen to create more jobs in the U.S. because of all of this pressure, if you will, coming from the White House to change trade deals and then even call out companies on Twitter. And I think that that's a big question for Canada's economy, considering how reliant Canada is becoming or wants to become on big technology companies, creating jobs here, locating facilities here. When a company like Apple is seeing its name out there on Twitter and wondering, you know, if we're going to create jobs in North America, are we going to do it, for example, in Canada or the United States?
Oh, I completely agree with that. At the same time, it's interesting that you mentioned this, John. I'm going to be in Ottawa tomorrow, Ottawa and Gatineau, where I'm going to be speaking with some policymakers and about 25,000 employees of the Canadian government and trying to figure out how best to use big data to improve services in Canada for Canadians. And this is incredibly important because the more that we learn together how to use these tools for the betterment of our society, the more this conversation can expand to beyond the talking heads on television or the policymakers or even the people on the back end in companies that you'll never meet but that you might find an occasional tweet from. I think the more that individuals are aware of what's going on, the more that they can weigh in. So your program offers an amazing service, but also this training with the Canadian government, I think, will also allow more people to be able to really firsthand not only look at the services that the government offers, but also when it comes to their own personal devices and their personal decisions when it comes to investment. What does it really mean to be private? What does it really mean to feel secure, not just on a meta level, but also on an individual level? So I think that this training, this new initiative that the government is undertaking to better utilize its data can only have positive repercussions for longer-term strategic decisions when it comes to the types of policies that are acceptable and not acceptable in Canada, and also what individuals, the decisions that they'll be able to make on their own. Again, with this Apple app, you know, now that's been taken down from the Apple Store and all of the security issues around it, I'm hoping that at the very least it's going to make people look more into VPNs, look more into using Tor, for example. These are all things that are available, they're free, but for the most part, not every single individual, and in fact I'd say the majority, even know what they are, let alone how to use them. So we need more public education, and the Canadian government is taking a really positive step there.
Okay, and Juliette, before you go, I want to talk a little bit about Apple's big event this week. Going to be new announcements, several iPhones, new iPad news, new Apple Watches. I think reports that there's going to be a new entry-level laptop. Give us a sense on what matters most. I mean, is there one product that really matters to the market? Is there a message that comes out of this event that you're watching really closely?
Well, I would say that the thing that resonated with me personally, and it's specifically on the privacy and security issue, is that there are rumors. Now, I do not have the final line as to whether this is true or not, but there are many, many rumors in security circles that they are doing away with the fingerprint ID, where your fingerprint will no longer necessarily be your identification, but rather they're going with the facial biometrics, the facial recognition of a person's face to unlock your phone on many of these devices. And it's fascinating when you think of the large picture of the amount of data that they're able to collect. Now they've got my fingerprint, then they have my face, they also have all my banking information and whatever other apps that I've allowed onto my phone that are all accessible on this one device. And so they're encouraging people, regardless of the new device that will be released this week, to make sure that you always have your Find My Phone, Find My iPad, Find My, my watch and whatnot. But there again, there are a lot of issues that are related to being able to track you wherever you go. And so it's great to have new toys. It's great to have new tech. But the improvements aren't necessarily improvements if you look at them in a larger context, again, depending on how comfortable you are when it comes to privacy or security. Now, that said, I've got to say that I am looking forward to getting a new iPhone.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Nowhere to hide because you want to get those new toys. Listen, it'll be fun to watch for sure. Juliette, always get to get your perspective. Thanks so much.